Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 4. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the t-tests. We'll start the lecture by first talking about what t-tests are, how we use them, and in what context is it appropriate to use a t-test for your statistical analysis. We'll then get into some of the specifics regarding the one sample t-test, the independent groups or the independent samples t-test, the paired sample t-test, and then finally wrap everything up with what happens if we violate the basic assumptions of those tests and require what I call non-parametric friends to still statistically analyze it with the same kind of question, but with a non-parametric procedure. So if you're ready to get started, let's go ahead and dig in. Okay, in this first video, we're going to dive into exactly what t-tests are. If we first start thinking about some of the research designs that we talked about in the first couple of lectures this term, we were talking about how there is something called an experimental design, right? Where we had a treatment group and we had a control group. And so the simplest form of an experiment is where we have our independent categorical variable, grouping variable, and there are only two possible levels or options for that independent categorical variable. So all independent variables by their nature are generally going to be categorical in nature. And when we talk about levels, we mean the options in order to effectively answer interesting research questions. So when we talk about a situation where we're using an experimental design, such as having a treatment group and a control group, you have a categorical variable, which would be the experimental condition, if you will, where you would have one level or option being the experiment, the other level or option being the control. But the key in this particular sequence is that there's only two possible outcomes, only two possible routes that a person who enters the study can actually engage with. And so when we talk about experimental designs, it makes sense in that way. Another key characteristic when we talk about experimental designs and where t-tests really fit in as a really useful tool to answer those kinds of questions is that regardless of whether a person receives a treatment group or a control group, or regardless if we're assessing a pre-test compared to a post-test, or regardless if we're comparing one whole sample to a known population parameter, the key here is from a dependent continuous variable perspective is that we're only measuring that dependent variable one time in the case of an experimental treatment versus control type of a design, or at most the whole sample twice in a pre-test, post-test kind of a design. So more often than not, when we manipulate the independent variable, you're either going to receive a treatment or a control. And as the slide shows here, one kind of research question that has an experimental design would be answering the question about, is systolic blood pressure lower following 40 minutes of aerobic exercise compared to a seated control session? And so because we only have aerobic exercise compared to a seated control session, we only have two entities, two means, two standard deviations, and we can compare the means and the standard deviations according to those two possibilities. A t-test really seems to make sense in how we analyze this question. So as we move through the rest of this lecture, I really want to focus on three different legs of this journey that we're going to walk on. We're first going to talk about what's called a one sample t-test, where we're comparing an entire sample of people, so one mean and one standard deviation, to a known population parameter that exists. Okay, and so what we want to try and determine is if the mean and the standard deviation of the sample is similar or congruent to the known population parameter that exists in the real world. In the second of the three videos, before we get to non-parametrics, is what's called the independent groups or the independent samples t-test, where we have sort of that traditional experiment versus control type of data set where we're comparing the means and the standard deviations of two groups that are different from each other, meaning the people in one group are not the same people as the people in another group, and we're measuring that dependent or continuous variable one time to generate the means and standard deviations in these groups. And we really just want to know, is the mean and the standard deviation of the experimental group statistically different from the mean and the standard deviation of the control group? And an independent samples t-test really does that nicely. And the third version of parametric t-test that we can think about is, let's say we want to look at a whole sample and we want to measure them under different time points or different conditions. So we're still collecting data in terms of means and standard deviations, but it's related data. So we're talking about the same group of people that we're measuring that dependent variable more than one time. This can exist in the form of a pre-test, post-test type design, such as if I was to measure your knowledge of statistics and health sciences at the beginning of the term compared to your knowledge of statistics at the end of the term, we would be able to take the same person before we introduce the education of the statistics and after the education has been learned to see if your knowledge, skills, and abilities of statistics and health sciences was statistically different before versus after you went through this class. So a paired sample t-test works really well in those types of situations. The other way of thinking about it, aside from pre-post testing, could be, let's say that we offer this class online and then we offer this class face-to-face. Let's say you have to enroll in this class 2 separate terms back-to-back in order to do so. You might first take the class completely online in the fall term and then come back in the winter term and take the exact same class face-to-face. And other people may start by taking the fall term face-to-face and then have the opportunity to take the online class in the winter term. And so because the same group of people are receiving different conditions, and the conditions in this case would be the face-to-face learning environment or the online learning environment, we can compare in the same person, the same group of people, how the group of people, their mean and standard deviation performs when in the context of a face-to-face setting compared to the same group of people when put into the context of an online setting. So a dependent or a matched sample case works really well in those kinds of situations. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and dive into the one sample t-test. We'll see you there.